The wind cut through the narrow streets of the city like a blade, and Alina Whitfield pulled her thin coat tighter as she rushed home from the bakery where she worked every night until the last loaf was wrapped and the ovens were cold. It was already past midnight, and the cobblestones were slick with frost. She had one thought only, to reach her small cottage before the cold reached her bones. That was when she heard it, a low groan coming from the mouth of a dark alley between two shuttered shops. Most people would have kept walking. The city at night was not a place for a young woman alone to go searching for trouble, but something in that sound stopped Alina where she stood. It was not the voice of a drunk man singing to himself, nor the cry of a stray dog. It was the sound of someone in real pain, someone who did not have the strength left to call for help properly. She stepped closer, her heart pounding, and there in the shadows she saw him. A man lay crumpled against the wall, his clothes torn and filthy, his face pale as chalk. His lips had turned a faint shade of blue, and his breathing came in short, rattling gasps. He looked like he had not eaten in days, and the frost on his eyelashes told her he had been lying there long enough for the cold to start doing its quiet, deadly work. Alina knelt beside him without a second thought. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, shaking his shoulder gently. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, just long enough to focus on her face and then closed again. He was alive, but only just. She looked around the empty street. There was no one to call for help, and even if there had been, she did not trust that a homeless stranger found half dead in an alley would be treated with any urgency by the men who ran the local watch house. She had heard stories of how such men were sometimes left to their fate, considered not worth the trouble. That thought made something harden inside her chest. She would not leave him here to die. She was not a large woman, and the stranger was tall, even folded up as he was against the wall. Getting him to his feet took every bit of strength she had. She looped his arm over her shoulders and half carried, half dragged him out of the alley, whispering encouragement the whole way, though he could not hear a word of it. Her cottage was only 2 streets away, but that short distance felt like miles with his full weight leaning into her side. By the time she reached her door, her arms were shaking and her breath came out in white clouds. She fumbled with the latch, pushed the door open with her hip and brought him inside, laying him down as gently as she could on the small bed near the fireplace. The fire had burned low while she was out, but there were still embers glowing beneath the ash. She fed them with kindling until flames rose again, filling the room with warmth and orange light. Only then did she really look at him. Beneath the dirt and the ragged clothes, there was something odd about this man. His hands, though rough with what looked like recent hardship, did not have the deep calluses of someone who had spent a lifetime doing hard labor. His jaw was strong, his features sharp and well-formed, the kind of face one might expect to see in a painting rather than lying half-frozen in a back alley. But Alina had no time to wonder about such things. His skin was too cold, his pulse too faint, and if she did not act quickly, none of it would matter. She stripped away his wet outer clothing, wrapped him in every blanket she owned, and pressed heated stones wrapped in cloth against his sides and feet, the way her grandmother had taught her to do for anyone caught too long in the cold. She spooned warm broth past his lips, patient enough to wait for each slow swallow, though half of it dribbled down his chin the first several tries. Hour after hour, she sat beside him, checking his breathing, rubbing warmth back into his hands, refusing to let herself fall asleep even as exhaustion pulled at her own body after a full night's work. Sometime near dawn, his breathing steadied. Color began to creep back into his face, and his shivering slowed until it finally stopped. Alina allowed herself a small, tired smile. He was going to live, at least through the night. She banked the fire once more, pulled a chair close to the bed, and finally allowed her eyes to close, though only for a few minutes at a time. When the man's eyes opened fully for the first time, the sun was already up, filtering weak winter light through the thin curtains. He stared at the ceiling in confusion, then turned his head slowly and found Alina watching him from the chair, a cup of tea warming her hands. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You're safe," Alina said gently. "I found you in an alley last night. You were very close to freezing. I brought you here." He tried to sit up too quickly and winced, pressing a hand to his ribs. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "Does a person need to know someone to help them?" she asked, a little surprised by the question. "You were dying. I couldn't just walk past." He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust what he was seeing. There was something guarded in his eyes, something that did not match the desperate, broken state she had found him in. It was the look of a man who was used to being suspicious of kindness, who expected people to want something in return for it. "What's your name?" she asked, hoping conversation might help settle him. He hesitated just for a heartbeat before answering, "Alex." It was not the truth, not fully. But in that moment he could not bring himself to say the name that had followed him his whole life, the name that came with titles and estates and enemies who wanted him dead. Alexander Ashford, Duke of Ravensmore, one of the most powerful and most feared men in all of England, had disappeared 3 nights ago from his own estate, fleeing for his life after discovering that someone close to him had hired men to kill him. He had run without a plan, without money, trading his fine clothes for rags along the road so no one would recognize him, until exhaustion and the cold had finally caught up to him in that alley. He could not tell this woman any of that. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. If word reached the wrong ears that the Duke of Ravensmore was alive and hiding in the home of a poor baker's assistant, her life would be in as much danger as his own. "Alex," Alina repeated, testing the name. "I'm Alina Whitfield. You're in my home in the Ashdown quarter of the city. You've been through something terrible from the look of you. You don't have to tell me what, not if you're not ready." Relief flickered across his face, quickly hidden again behind that careful, guarded expression. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for finding me, for everything." "You should rest," she told him, standing to check the pot of broth still warming over the fire. "You're weak, and your body needs time before it can do much of anything." He wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he had somewhere to be, people depending on him, a household in chaos without its master. But when he tried to push himself upright again, the room spun and his strength gave out entirely, forcing him back against the pillow. Alina was at his side in an instant, steadying him. "You're not going anywhere today," she said firmly, though not unkindly. "Not like this." He looked up at her, this stranger who had risked her own safety to drag a dying man off the street, who had spent the whole night keeping him warm and breathing broth into him without asking for a single coin in return, and something shifted inside him. He had spent years surrounded by people who smiled at him only because of his title, who calculated every kindness for what it might earn them later. This woman did not know he was a duke. She did not know he owned half the county, or that men in Parliament listened when he spoke, or that his name alone could open or close doors across the kingdom. To her, he was simply a suffering stranger who needed help, and she had given it freely. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander felt something close to safety. "Thank you, Alina," he said again, and this time his voice carried something warmer than gratitude, though neither of them could yet name what it was. Outside, the city carried on as it always did, unaware that within those thin cottage walls, a secret was beginning to unfold, one that would eventually reach every corner of the kingdom. But for now, in the quiet warmth of that small room, there was only a woman determined to save a stranger's life, and a man who did not yet know how to tell her that saving his life might one day put her own in terrible danger. Alina busied herself preparing more broth, glancing back at him now, and then as he drifted in and out of exhausted sleep. She had no way of knowing that the man resting in her bed was the subject of frantic searches across the county, that men loyal to him were combing every road and tavern for word of his whereabouts, or that others, men with far darker intentions, were doing the very same thing, hoping to finish what they had started 3 nights before. All she knew was that a stranger named Alex had nearly died in the cold, and that something told her his story was far from finished. 3 days passed before Alexander could stand without his legs shaking beneath him. Alina had given up her own bed entirely, sleeping on a thin mat by the fire, waking every few hours through habit to check that his breathing was still even. She never once complained, and she never once asked him to leave, though she must have known that keeping a stranger in her home put her own reputation at risk in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business. On the fourth morning, Alexander woke to the smell of bread baking, a smell so warm and familiar it almost undid him. He had grown up in a house with a kitchen larger than most people's entire homes, staffed by cooks who prepared meals fit for royalty. Yet none of those elaborate dishes had ever smelled as good to him as the simple loaf rising in Aline's small oven that morning. He found her kneading dough at a wooden table, her sleeves pushed up, flour dusting her forearms. She looked up when she heard him and smiled, the kind of smile that came without calculation, without any hidden motive behind it. "You're standing," she said, clearly pleased. "That's good. Come, sit before you fall, I have tea." He obeyed, lowering himself carefully into the chair across from her. His body still ached in places he had not known could ache, but the fog in his mind had cleared enough for him to think properly again, and thinking properly brought its own troubles. He needed to know what was happening at his estate. He needed to know whether his sister, Charlotte, was safe, and whether the men who had tried to kill him had given up the search or were still hunting for him even now. But he could not simply walk out the door and ask questions as the Duke of Ravensmoor, not without risking discovery by the very people trying to end his life. "You've been very kind to me," he said instead, watching her work the dough with practiced hands. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." "You don't need to repay me," Alina said, not looking up. "I didn't help you expecting anything back." "Still, a man doesn't forget a debt like this." She glanced at him then, something curious in her expression. "You talk like an educated man, Alex, careful with your words. Where are you from?" The question caught him off guard, though he should have expected it eventually. He had been careless, letting his usual manner of speech slip through despite his best efforts to sound rougher, more common. He forced a shrug, keeping his tone light. "I've had some schooling long ago. Different life before things went wrong." "What kind of things?" Alina asked, setting the dough aside to rise and wiping her hands on her apron. She sat across from him, giving him her full attention in a way that made him feel oddly exposed. "You don't have to tell me. I only ask because you don't seem like a man who has spent his whole life on the streets. Your hands aren't the hands of someone who's done that kind of hard living for years." He looked down at his own hands, turning them over as though seeing them for the first time. She was observant, more observant than he had given her credit for. He would need to be more careful. "I had a falling out with people I trusted," he said, choosing his words with great care, staying as close to the truth as he dared without revealing anything that could endanger her. "People who decided they wanted something that belonged to me and were willing to hurt me to get it. I had to run. I didn't plan for it to happen the way it did." Alina's expression softened with sympathy, though she did not push for more details, sensing perhaps that he had given her all he was willing to share for now. "That sounds frightening," she said simply. "I'm sorry that happened to you." "You don't need to apologize. None of it was your doing." He paused, then added, quieter, "You're the first person in a long time who's helped me without wanting something in return. It's not something I'm used to." "Then maybe you've been surrounded by the wrong sort of people," Alina said with a small, wry smile, standing to check on the bread. If only she knew how right she was. Over the following days, a quiet routine began to form between them. Alina left each morning for her work at the bakery, and Alexander, still too weak to do much, found small ways to make himself useful around her cottage. He fixed a wobbling table leg with tools he found in a shed out back, drawing on knowledge he had never expected to use, learned as a boy when his father, believing a future duke should understand every corner of his estate, had insisted he spend time with the carpenters and stable hands rather than only with tutors of politics and law. He mended a torn curtain, clumsily at first, his fingers unused to needlework, but improving with practice. He swept the small yard and stacked firewood, careful never to overexert himself in ways that would raise Alina's suspicion about how quickly his strength was truly returning. Each evening, when Alina returned home smelling of flour and yeast, exhausted from hours of standing before hot ovens, she would find her small home a little cleaner, a little more comfortable than she had left it. She never asked him to do these things, and at first she tried to insist he rest instead, but she soon realized that idleness seemed to trouble him more than physical effort did, so she let him help in whatever small ways he could manage. They began sharing meals together at her small table, simple food, bread and broth, and whatever vegetables she could afford. But Alexander found he looked forward to those meals more than he had ever looked forward to the extravagant dinners served in his own dining hall, surrounded by guests who flattered him to his face and schemed against him the moment his back was turned. Elinor was easy to talk with, quick to laugh at small things, and unafraid to speak her mind even when her opinions differed from his. She told him about her parents, both gone now, her father lost to a fever when she was young, her mother passing only 2 years before. She told him about her dream of one day having a small bakery of her own, rather than working long hours for someone else's shop and someone else's profit. She spoke of these hopes plainly, without bitterness about her circumstances, simply as facts of her life that she intended to change through her own hard work. Alexander found himself telling her small truths in return, careful always to stay vague about details that might reveal his identity, but honest about his feelings in ways he had rarely been honest with anyone. He told her about missing his mother, who had died when he was a boy, leaving him to be raised largely by tutors and stewards rather than warmth and affection. He told her, without naming names or places, about growing up surrounded by people who valued him only for what he could give them, and how exhausting it had become to never fully trust anyone's intentions. "That sounds lonely," Elinor said one evening, after he had shared more than he intended to about his past. "Having everything, yet trusting no one." "It is," he admitted, surprised at how easily the admission came. "I didn't realize how lonely until now." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers briefly, warmly, before pulling back as though suddenly aware of what she had done. "Well, you're not alone right now," she said, a little flustered. "For whatever that's worth." "It's worth quite a lot," he said quietly, and meant it more than she could possibly understand. But even as the days brought them closer, worry gnawed constantly at the back of Alexander's mind. He thought often of Charlotte, his younger sister, likely frantic with fear over his disappearance, and of Charles Bennet, his steward, a man who had served the Ashford family faithfully for over 20 years, and who would surely be searching every corner of the county for some sign of his master. He thought too of his cousin, Edmund, whose ambition had always simmered just beneath a polished, agreeable surface, and whose recent behavior, in hindsight, now seemed heavy with warning signs Alexander had been too trusting to notice before it nearly cost him his life. He knew he could not hide in Elinor's small cottage forever. Eventually he would need to return, to face whoever had betrayed him, to reclaim his place and ensure his household and the people who depended on him were safe. But every time he considered leaving, something held him back, some reluctance that had less to do with his still recovering strength and more to do with the quiet contentment he had found within these 4 humble walls. He told himself he needed a little more time to plan, a little more time to be certain he could return safely without immediately walking into another trap. He told himself many things in those quiet days to justify staying just a little longer. But beneath all his careful reasoning was a simpler truth he was not yet ready to admit even to himself. He did not want to leave Elinor Whitfield, and he was terrified of what might happen once she learned exactly who he truly was. Late one night, unable to sleep, Alexander sat by the dying fire and thought of the night everything had gone wrong. He had been in his study, going over ledgers with Edmund, discussing matters of the estate as they had done many evenings before. He remembered feeling suddenly unwell, a strange heaviness settling over him that no amount of fresh air seemed to ease. He remembered stumbling toward the door, catching a glimpse of Edmund's expression in the reflection of a dark window, an expression that held none of the concern a cousin should show for a man growing suddenly and mysteriously ill. After that his memories grew fragmented, being half carried, half dragged from the house by men he did not recognize. The cold night air, a struggle near the edge of the estate grounds that left him bruised and gasping. Somehow, through sheer desperate will, breaking free and running until his lungs burned and his legs gave out somewhere along a road he did not recognize. In clothes he had stripped from a scarecrow to disguise himself, walking for what felt like days with no food and barely any rest, until the cold finally caught up with him in that alley where Alina had found him. Someone in his own household had poisoned him, or drugged him, enough to weaken him for whatever had been planned next. And the only person who had been in that study with him that evening, the only person positioned to have done such a thing, was Edmund. The thought still felt like a betrayal too large to fully accept, even now, days later. Edmund, who had grown up alongside him, who had shared holidays and hunting trips and quiet evenings by the fire since they were boys. Edmund, who stood to inherit everything should Alexander die without an heir of his own. Alexander stared into the last glowing embers of the fire and made himself a quiet promise. He would find a way to uncover the full truth of what had happened, and he would make certain that whoever was responsible faced justice for it. But he would not rush into danger blindly this time, not when doing so might also put Alina at risk simply for having crossed his path. He glanced toward the small bed where Alina slept peacefully, her breathing slow and even, utterly unaware of the storm gathering just beyond her humble front door. Whatever came next, he decided, he would find a way to protect her from it, even if that meant eventually walking away from the only genuine warmth he had known in years. 2 weeks passed, and with them, Alexander's strength returned almost fully, though he was careful never to let Alina see quite how quickly he had healed, for fear she would begin asking harder questions about who he truly was and where he had truly come from. He had grown skilled at small deceptions by then, not out of any wish to hurt her, but because he had convinced himself that protecting her meant protecting the truth from her as well. It was a market day when everything nearly unraveled. Alina had asked him to help carry supplies from the square, since her own arms could not manage everything alone, and Alexander, feeling strong enough and restless enough from days spent mostly indoors, had agreed without much thought. The market was crowded, full of noise and color and the smell of roasting chestnuts, and for a while Alexander allowed himself to simply enjoy it, walking beside Alina as she haggled cheerfully over the price of flour and eggs, laughing at his clumsy attempt to bargain for a bundle of carrots. Then he saw a face he recognized. Across the square, speaking quietly with a merchant, stood a man Alexander knew to be in Edmund's employ, a sharp-featured fellow named Harold Gray, who had served as something between a bodyguard and a messenger for his cousin over the past several years. Alexander's blood went cold. If Harold was here in this part of the city, it meant Edmund's search for him had widened, had grown desperate enough to send men into ordinary neighborhoods where a duke would never normally be expected to hide. He grabbed Alina's arm gently but urgently, steering her toward a different row of stalls, putting distance and crowd between himself and Harold's line of sight. "What's wrong?" Alina asked, startled by the sudden change in him. "Nothing," he said quickly, too quickly, and she gave him a look that told him she did not believe that for a moment. "I just remembered we needed something from the other side of the market." She let it go, though her eyes lingered on him a beat longer than usual, and Alexander spent the rest of their time in the square glancing over his shoulder, his heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with his old illness and everything to do with fear. That night, once Alina had gone to sleep, Alexander sat awake for hours, turning the encounter over in his mind. If Harold had seen him, if he had recognized him despite the ragged clothes and the weeks of hardship that had changed his appearance, then Alina's home was no longer safe, not for either of them. He needed a plan, something beyond simply hiding and hoping to remain unnoticed forever. He thought of Charles Bennet, his steward, a man of unshakable loyalty who had served the Ashford family since before Alexander was born. If anyone could be trusted to help without also reporting back to Edmund, it was Charles. But finding a way to reach him without revealing Alexander's location to the wrong people would require careful planning. The following morning, Alexander made a decision. He would write to Charles, using a method secretive enough that even if the letter were intercepted, it would give away nothing useful to his enemies. He asked Alina, without explaining fully why, whether she knew anyone reliable who could carry a private letter across the county for a fair payment, someone discreet who would ask no questions. Alina considered this for a long moment, studying him with growing curiosity. "You keep saying things that make me wonder just how ordinary your old life really was, Alex," she said carefully. "A man on the run from thieves doesn't usually need discreet couriers and private letters." He met her gaze, weighing how much to reveal. Everything in him wanted to tell her the truth, to stop hiding behind half-answers and careful phrasing, but the fear of what that truth might cost her held him back still. "I told you I had a different life before," he said finally. "Some parts of it I'm not ready to explain yet. I promise you, when I can tell you everything, I will. Right now, all I can say is that it matters a great deal that this letter reaches the right person quietly." Alina studied him a moment longer, and though frustration flickered briefly across her face, it faded into something closer to trust. "There's a boy named Peter who runs errands for the bakery sometimes," she said. "He's quick, and he knows how to keep quiet if you pay him well enough. I'll ask him." "Thank you," Alexander said, relief washing through him. "I mean that, Alina. More than you know." That afternoon, he wrote his letter with painstaking care, choosing his words so that only Charles, who knew certain private details of Alexander's childhood that no outsider could possibly guess, would understand the letter's true meaning and sender. He signed it not with his name, but with a small drawing of a raven, a private joke between himself and Charles from years earlier, when a young Alexander had once tried, and spectacularly failed, to tame a wild raven he'd found injured on the estate grounds. Peter, the errand boy, took the letter without asking questions, pocketing his payment and disappearing into the crowded streets, with the easy confidence of someone who had run far more dangerous errands in his young life than this one. Alexander watched him go, his stomach twisting with uncertainty, unsure whether he had just taken a necessary step toward reclaiming his life, or a reckless one that would bring danger crashing down on Alina's doorstep. The days that followed were tense with waiting. Alexander found himself constantly glancing toward the window whenever footsteps sounded outside, his body coiled with a readiness to protect Alina that surprised him with its intensity. He had faced dangerous situations before, difficult negotiations, political rivals who wished him ill, but he had never before felt fear quite like this, fear not for himself but for someone else's safety. Alina noticed the change in him, of course. She was too observant not to. "You're different lately," she said one evening, as they sat together after supper, the fire casting warm shadows across the small room. "More careful, watching the door like you're expecting someone." "I suppose I am," Alexander admitted, unable to fully hide it any longer. "Are we in danger?" she asked, her voice steady despite the seriousness of the question. He hesitated, then decided that she deserved at least this much honesty, even if he could not yet tell her everything. "I might be," he said carefully. "The people I was running from, they haven't stopped looking for me. I saw someone in the market who might recognize me, someone connected to them. I've sent word to a friend I trust, someone who can help me sort this out properly. But until I hear back, there's a chance that danger could follow me here to your home." Alina absorbed this information with a calm that surprised him. She did not panic, did not demand he leave immediately for her own safety, though he half expected and almost hoped she would, believing it might be safer for her if he simply disappeared from her life before things grew worse. "Then we'll be careful," she said simply. "But I'm not asking you to leave, Alex, not unless that's what you want." "It's not what I want," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "It's the last thing I want." Something passed between them in that moment, unspoken but unmistakable, a recognition of feelings that had been growing steadily beneath the surface of their daily routines and quiet conversations. Alina's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her hands, suddenly shy in a way that was unlike her usual straightforward manner. "I should get us more firewood," she said, standing quickly, though the fire was already burning well enough. Alexander let her go without comment, understanding the need for a moment to gather herself, feeling something similar stirring in his own chest. Over the next several days, while they waited for any word from Charles, their bond deepened in small, quiet ways. Alexander taught Alina to play a card game he remembered from childhood, one his mother had taught him before she passed, and found himself laughing more freely than he had in years, as Alina cheerfully cheated at the rules whenever she thought he wasn't looking. Alina, in turn, taught him to properly knead bread dough, guiding his hands with hers, an act of simple physical closeness that left them both a little breathless despite its innocence. He learned the small details of her life that painted a fuller picture of who she was, how she had taken over caring for her ailing mother at just 15 years old, working every spare hour to keep food on their table while her mother's health declined. How she had buried her mother with money saved coin by coin over years, refusing charity from neighbors who offered it, determined to give her mother a proper farewell through her own labor and sacrifice. How, even after losing everyone she had ever called family, she had not allowed grief to harden her heart against the world, choosing instead to remain someone who would drag a dying stranger off the street rather than walk past his suffering. Alexander found himself falling for her more deeply with each passing day, and the realization terrified him almost as much as the danger still hunting him through the shadows of the city. He was Duke of Ravensmoor, a man whose marriage, whenever it eventually occurred, would be scrutinized and negotiated by half the aristocracy of England, treated as a matter of political alliance rather than personal choice. Alina Whitfield, however extraordinary she was, however deeply he had come to care for her, belonged to a world so far removed from his own that the distance between them felt, in his darker moments, insurmountable. Yet when he looked at her, laughing over a card game or humming softly while she worked dough into shape, that distance seemed to matter less and less. Perhaps he allowed himself to hope, once this danger had passed and he had reclaimed his rightful place, there might be some way to bridge the gap between the life he had been born into and the life he had come, quite unexpectedly, to want. But hope, he reminded himself firmly on the nights when doubt crept in, meant nothing until the truth was told. And the truth, when it finally emerged, might well destroy everything they had so carefully built between them. While Alexander waited anxiously within the walls of Alina's cottage, far across the county, at the grand estate known as Ravensmoor Hall, chaos had settled into the household like a fog that would not lift. Lady Charlotte Ashford, Alexander's younger sister, had not slept properly in the 3 weeks since her brother vanished without a trace. She paced the long hallways at night, questioning every servant who might have seen or heard something useful, refusing to accept the quiet suggestions from certain corners of the household that the Duke might simply have left of his own accord, perhaps overwhelmed by the pressures of his position. Charlotte did not believe that for a single moment. Her brother was many things, stern, guarded, sometimes too consumed by duty to show much warmth, but he was not a man who abandoned his responsibilities without word or warning. Something had happened to him, something dark, and she suspected, though she had no proof yet to act upon, that the answer lay closer to home than anyone wished to admit. Her suspicion centered increasingly on their cousin, Edmund Ashford, who had taken to managing estate affairs in Alexander's absence with an ease and confidence that struck Charlotte as unsettling rather than reassuring. Edmund spoke often of Alexander's return, expressed concern in all the appropriate tones during family gatherings and meetings with estate officials. Yet there was something in his manner, a certain relaxed comfort in his newfound authority, that Charlotte could not shake from her mind as deeply wrong. Charles Bennet, the family's longtime steward, shared her unease, though the two of them had been careful never to voice their suspicions openly, unsure who among the staff might report their words back to Edmund. Charles had served the Ashford family for over 2 decades, first under Alexander's father and now under Alexander himself, and he knew the family's private history well enough to remember a young Edmund who had once, as a boy of perhaps 12 years old, sulked for an entire summer after learning that Alexander, 3 years his senior, would one day inherit everything while Edmund, despite equal blood ties to the family name, would inherit comparatively little. That old childhood resentment, Charles suspected, had never truly faded. It had simply learned to hide itself well beneath years of polite smiles and dutiful family loyalty. It was on a quiet afternoon, while sorting through correspondence in his study, that Charles Bennet received a letter that made his hands tremble with sudden, overwhelming relief. The handwriting on the outside was disguised, clearly meant to avoid recognition by anyone who might intercept it, but the small drawing of a raven sketched beside the seal told him immediately who had sent it. He locked his study door before opening the letter, his old heart pounding as he read Alexander's careful words, confirming that the Duke was alive, that he had survived whatever had happened to him that terrible night, and that he was currently recovering in a location he could not yet reveal, under the care of someone he trusted, though he gave no name. The letter asked Charles to quietly investigate matters at the estate, to determine, without alerting Edmund or anyone loyal to him, exactly what had occurred that night, and to find a safe way to send word back through the same discreet channel the letter had arrived by, care of a young errand boy named Peter who could be found near the central market square. Charles read the letter 3 times before allowing himself to breathe easily. His master was alive. Whatever else had happened, whatever dangers still lingered, that single fact changed everything. He immediately began planning how best to investigate without drawing suspicion, understanding that a single misstep could alert Edmund to the fact that his plan, whatever its exact nature had been, had failed. Over the following days, Charles moved carefully through the household, asking quiet questions of servants he trusted absolutely, piecing together fragments of information about the night Alexander disappeared. A stable hand recalled seeing unfamiliar men near the estate's edge that night, men who did not belong to any household staff, moving with the quiet purpose of people who did not wish to be seen. A kitchen maid remembered preparing a late evening drink for the Duke's study at Edmund's specific request, an unusual request given that such small tasks were normally handled by the Duke's personal valet rather than routed through his cousin. Piece by piece, a troubling picture began to form, though Charles was careful to record nothing in writing that could be discovered and used against him, should his inquiries somehow reach Edmund's ears. Meanwhile, Charlotte continued her own careful observations, noting how Edmund had begun quietly meeting with certain business associates whose reputations, upon closer inquiry through trusted family friends, proved less than respectable, men known for arranging matters that required discretion and a willingness to look past legal boundaries when sufficiently paid to do so. Neither Charlotte nor Charles yet had proof enough to formally accuse Edmund of anything, and both understood the danger of moving too quickly, without solid ground beneath their suspicions. Edmund had grown too comfortable in his temporary authority to be confronted carelessly, and any premature accusation, without sufficient evidence, risked only alerting him to their suspicions, while giving him ample opportunity to cover his tracks more thoroughly, or worse, to finish what he had apparently started against Alexander in the first place. So they waited, gathering evidence quietly, holding on to the fragile hope contained within that single letter bearing a raven's small sketch, praying that wherever Alexander was hiding, he remained safe until enough proof could be gathered to bring his enemies fully into the light. Back within the modest walls of Aliner's cottage, Alexander received Charles's reply nearly a week after sending his own letter, delivered once again through young Peter, who had proven himself entirely trustworthy and admirably discreet throughout the exchange. Reading his steward's careful account of the investigation underway at Ravensmoor Hall, Alexander felt a complicated mixture of emotions wash over him. Relief that his household remained functioning, and that Charlotte, at least, was safe and fighting in his corner, alongside a deep, cold anger at the growing confirmation of Edmund's likely betrayal. He read the letter twice, memorizing its details, before feeding it carefully into the fire, watching the parchment curl and blacken until nothing remained that could implicate anyone should the ashes somehow be discovered. Aliner found him sitting by the fire afterward, staring into the flames with an expression she had not seen on him before, something harder and more determined than the cautious, gentle man she had come to know over the past weeks. "Something's changed," she observed, settling into the chair across from him. "You've heard from your friend." "I have," Alexander confirmed, meeting her eyes directly for perhaps the first time since this conversation had begun. "And I think it's time I told you more of the truth, Eleanor. Not all of it yet, I'm not ready for that, but enough that you understand what you might be risking by continuing to let me stay here." Eleanor sat very still, sensing the weight behind his words. "All right," she said quietly, "tell me." "The people who tried to kill me," he began, choosing his words with care, "are more powerful and more dangerous than I let on before. This isn't a simple matter of thieves or common criminals. It involves my own family, people with real influence and resources, people who would not hesitate to hurt anyone standing in their way, including someone innocent who simply happened to help me when I needed it most." Eleanor's expression remained steady, though he saw a flicker of fear pass briefly across her features. "Are you saying I might be in danger because of you?" "I'm saying it's possible," he admitted, hating how much the admission cost him to voice aloud. "I would understand completely if you wanted me to leave, to protect yourself from whatever might still be coming." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing, staring into the fire much as he had been doing moments before. Then she looked up at him, and her expression held a resolve that took his breath away entirely. "You saved yourself that night, Alex, by surviving long enough for me to find you," she said firmly. "I chose to help you. That choice was mine, and I don't regret it, no matter what danger might come with it. I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to trust me enough to face whatever's coming together, rather than alone." Alexander stared at her, overwhelmed by a wave of gratitude and affection so powerful it nearly undid him entirely. He had spent his whole life surrounded by people calculating their own advantage, and here was a woman offering to stand beside him against unknown danger, simply because she had decided, once and completely, that he was worth standing beside. "Eleanor," he said softly, reaching for her hand across the small space between their chairs, "I don't deserve kindness like this." "Everyone deserves kindness, Alex," she said simply, her fingers curling around his. "Especially someone who spent his life believing otherwise." Neither of them spoke further that evening, content simply to sit together by the firelight, hands joined, drawing strength and comfort from each other's quiet presence while, unknown to them both, the careful investigation unfolding many miles away drew slowly, steadily closer to uncovering the full and dangerous truth. Winter began to soften into early spring, and with it came a change in the rhythm of Eleanor's small household. The frost that once coated the windows each morning grew thinner, then disappeared altogether, replaced by pale sunlight that filtered warmly through the curtains. Alexander had grown stronger with each passing week, his body fully recovered from the ordeal that had nearly claimed his life, though he was careful still to hide the full extent of his returning vigor, worried that too sudden a transformation might raise questions Eleanor was not yet ready to have answered. But some things could not be hidden forever, no matter how carefully managed. Eleanor had begun noticing small details that did not fit the picture of the man Alex claimed to be. She noticed how he stood a little too straight, how his manners at the table, though he tried to soften them, carried the unmistakable polish of someone raised with etiquette tutors rather than practical necessity. She noticed how he sometimes referenced knowledge of faraway places, of politics and law, that seemed far beyond what a man of humble means could reasonably be expected to possess. One evening, while helping her mend a torn shirt, his own shirt in fact, since his original clothes had been replaced weeks earlier with simpler garments Eleanor had purchased for him with her modest savings, Alexander made an offhand comment about a particular style of embroidery, noting that it resembled a pattern favored by certain noble households in the northern counties. The observation slipped out before he could stop himself, an old habit from childhood lessons about heraldry and family crests that he had never quite managed to fully suppress. Eleanor paused her needle mid-stitch, looking up at him with an expression that was equal parts curious and searching. "How would you know something like that, Alex?" He hesitated a beat too long before answering, and that hesitation alone told her more than any words could have. "I told you," he said carefully, "I had a different life before. I picked up all kinds of strange knowledge along the way." "That's what you always say," Alina replied, setting the needlework down entirely now, her full attention fixed on him. "You always say that, and then you change the subject, or you go quiet, or you find some reason to leave the room. I've let it go this long because I understood you had your reasons, and because I trusted that whatever you were hiding, it wasn't meant to hurt me. But Alex, we've been sharing this home for nearly 2 months now. I think I deserve to know who you really are." The moment had arrived, sooner perhaps than he had intended, but arrived nonetheless. And Alexander found himself standing at a crossroads he had been quietly dreading since the very first morning he woke in her care. He could continue deflecting, offering vague half-truths that would satisfy her curiosity only temporarily, or he could finally tell her everything, and risk whatever consequences that honesty might bring to the fragile, precious thing that had grown between them. He set down the shirt he had been holding and met her eyes directly. "You're right," he said quietly. "You deserve the truth, Alina, all of it. I've been afraid to give it to you, not because I don't trust you, but because I was afraid of what it might change between us." Alina's expression softened slightly, though the searching look in her eyes did not fade. "Nothing you tell me is going to make me regret helping you that night," she said. "But I need to understand what I've been part of, Alex, please." He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of weeks of careful concealment pressing down on him all at once. "My name isn't Alex," he began, his voice low and steady despite the storm of emotion churning beneath the surface. "Or rather, it is, but it's only part of my full name. My full name is Alexander Ashford. I hold the title of Duke of Ravensmoor." The words hung in the air between them, and Alina's face went through a rapid succession of expressions. Confusion first, then dawning disbelief, then something that looked almost like betrayal, though she said nothing yet, simply staring at him as though trying to reconcile the ragged, half-frozen stranger she had carried home weeks before with the powerful title he had just claimed. "You're a duke," she repeated slowly, testing the words as though they belonged to a language she did not fully understand. "One of the wealthiest men in England, and you've been living in my cottage, letting me feed you broth from a chipped bowl and mend your shirts, while I had no idea." "I know how it sounds," Alexander said quickly, leaning forward with urgency. "I know it sounds like a lie, or worse, like I was mocking your kindness somehow, but I promise you, Alina, nothing about what's grown between us has been false. Not one moment of it." "Then why lie?" Alina's voice rose slightly, hurt bleeding through the careful control she had maintained until now. "Why not tell me the truth from the beginning, once you were well enough to speak clearly? Did you think I would treat you differently if I knew? Did you think I'd suddenly demand payment, or start fawning over you the way I suppose people do around men with titles?" "No," he said firmly, standing now, closing the distance between them though he did not touch her, sensing she needed space in this moment. "I didn't lie to protect myself from your reaction, Alina. I lied to protect you. The people who tried to kill me are still out there, still searching for me. If word had spread that the missing Duke of Ravensmoor was hiding in the home of a baker's assistant in this quarter of the city, you would have become a target too, whether from those enemies trying to silence anyone who might know something useful, or simply from the attention and danger that comes with being connected to someone in my position. I was trying to keep you safe by keeping you in the dark." Alina was quiet for a long moment, processing this, her anger and hurt visibly warring with the logic of what he was explaining. "You could have trusted me to understand that," she finally said, though some of the sharp edge had left her voice. "You could have told me the danger without needing to hide who you were entirely." "You're right," Alexander admitted, the honesty costing him something real, though he pushed through it anyway. "I should have found a way to trust you sooner. I've spent so many years surrounded by people who couldn't be trusted with anything real that I forgot how to recognize someone who actually deserved that trust from the beginning. I'm sorry, Alina." "Truly." She studied him for a long moment, arms crossed, clearly still working through the flood of information and its implications. "So what happens now?" she asked eventually. Now that I know, are you going to leave, go back to your estate, back to your real life? The question struck him harder than he expected, and he realized with sudden clarity exactly how much he did not want the answer to be yes. Not entirely, not in the way that would mean leaving Alina behind for good. I need to go back eventually, he admitted. There are people at my estate depending on me, people I care about who deserve to know I'm alive and well. There's also the matter of finding proof against whoever tried to have me killed, and ensuring they face justice for it, and that I'm not in danger again the moment I return. But Alina, I don't want this, whatever this is between us, to end simply because I have to return to that world. I know it seems impossible, the distance between who I am and who you are, but I've never felt about anyone the way I've come to feel about you these past 2 months. Alina's composure finally cracked slightly, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes though she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let them fall. This is a lot to take in, Alexander, whoever you are right now, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I need time. Time to think about all of this, about what it means, about whether something like what you're describing is even possible between people from such different worlds. Take all the time you need, Alexander said softly, though every part of him wanted to close the distance between them and tell her that time did not matter, that his feelings would not change no matter how long she needed to sort through her own. I owe you that, and so much more. That night Alina slept poorly, her mind churning through everything she had learned, replaying every strange detail from the past weeks that now made perfect sense in light of the truth. The way he carried himself, the education evident in his speech despite his attempts to hide it, the careful letters sent through Peter, the fear he had shown after glimpsing someone in the market. All of it fit now, forming a complete picture that both explained and complicated everything she thought she understood about the man sleeping, or more likely also lying awake, in the next room. She thought about her own feelings, feelings that had grown steadily over the past 2 months without her fully acknowledging their depth, until this moment forced her to examine them honestly. She had fallen for Alex, whoever he truly was beneath the title and the estate and the powerful name. She had fallen for his gentleness, his willingness to help with small chores despite clearly having never done such work before, his genuine curiosity about her life and dreams, the warmth in his eyes whenever he looked at her that had nothing to do with duty or obligation. But could that same warmth survive the return to his real world? A world of estates and titles and social expectations that had absolutely no place in it for a baker's assistant with flour permanently worked into the creases of her hands. She did not know, and the uncertainty frightened her more than his revealed identity ever could. In the next room, Alexander lay equally sleepless, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation, wondering if he had just destroyed something precious through weeks of well-intentioned but ultimately hurtful deception. He thought of his father, who had married for political advantage rather than affection, and had spent his life in a marriage devoid of any real warmth as a result. He thought of the countless society women who had been paraded before him over the years by well-meaning relatives, each one polished and proper and utterly incapable of making him feel the way Alina made him feel with nothing more than her honest laughter and her stubborn insistence on kindness, even toward complete strangers. He did not know what the future held, whether the distance between their two worlds could truly be bridged, or whether circumstances and society's rigid expectations would ultimately force them apart despite whatever feelings had grown between them. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised him with its intensity, that he did not want to face that uncertain future without her by his side, whatever form that might eventually take. Morning came slowly, gray light creeping across the small room, and when Alina finally rose and found Alexander already awake, sitting quietly by the cold hearth, neither of them spoke at first, the weight of the previous night's revelations still hanging heavily between them. I've thought about it, Alina finally said, breaking the silence, her voice steady though her eyes betrayed a night of little rest. I'm still angry that you didn't trust me sooner, but I understand why you did what you did and I meant what I said before. I'm not asking you to leave. Whatever comes next, whatever complications your title brings, I want to face them honestly together, rather than through more secrets. Relief flooded through Alexander so powerfully he had to steady himself against the mantel. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise you, Alina, from this moment forward, no more secrets. Whatever we face it with complete honesty between us." It was a promise he intended to keep, though neither of them yet knew how quickly and how severely that promise would soon be tested. As the careful investigation unfolding at Ravensmoor Hall drew ever closer to a discovery that would force Alexander back into the dangerous world he had been hiding from, whether he and Alina were ready for it or not. Charles Bennet had spent 3 careful weeks gathering fragments of evidence, moving through Ravensmoor Hall like a man walking across thin ice, aware that a single wrong step could shatter everything he had painstakingly pieced together. By the time he felt confident enough in what he had learned to act, the picture had become undeniable. Edmund Ashford had arranged for a servant loyal only to him, a man recently hired and just as recently vanished from the estate without explanation, to slip a dangerous substance into Alexander's evening drink, weakening him enough for hired men to overpower and remove him from the grounds under cover of darkness, intending to make his death look like the unfortunate result of wandering off while unwell, lost and exposed to the harsh winter cold. The plan had nearly worked perfectly, foiled only by Alexander's own desperate will to survive, and by the extraordinary kindness of a stranger who had refused to walk past a dying man in an alley. Armed finally with enough evidence to act, and having received word from Peter, the errand boy, about roughly where letters exchanged with Alexander had originated within the city, Charles made the difficult decision to travel there himself, accompanied by 2 trusted household guards, men whose loyalty to the Ashford family predated Edmund's growing influence, and who could be relied upon absolutely. They arrived in the Ashdown quarter on a bright spring morning, and it took the better part of a day asking careful, discreet questions before Charles finally narrowed his search to a small cottage on a quiet street, the home of a young bakery worker named Alina Whitfield, whom several neighbors mentioned as having taken in a mysterious stranger some weeks before. Standing outside that modest wooden door, Charles felt his hands trembling with an emotion he had not allowed himself to fully feel throughout the entire ordeal, a desperate hope that in mere moments he might finally see with his own eyes that his young master was truly alive and safe. He knocked and Alina answered, her expression immediately wary at the sight of 3 unfamiliar, well-dressed men standing at her humble doorstep. "Can I help you?" she asked, positioning herself slightly to block the doorway, protective instincts already rising despite not yet knowing why. "Forgive the intrusion, miss," Charles said, removing his hat respectfully despite the urgency thrumming through him. "My name is Charles Bennet. I believe I may be looking for someone currently residing here, a man who might have introduced himself simply as Alex." Before Alina could respond, Alexander appeared behind her in the doorway, and the moment Charles saw his face, weathered by hardship but unmistakably alive, relief broke across the old steward's features so completely that he nearly wept on the spot. "Your Grace," Charles breathed, bowing deeply despite his advancing age, the formal address carrying clearly across the quiet street. "Thank heaven. We feared the worst." Several neighbors, drawn by the unusual sight of finely dressed strangers on their humble street, had begun to gather at a respectful distance, murmuring among themselves at the strange scene unfolding, and at that formal title spoken aloud for anyone nearby to hear. Alina turned to look at Alexander, and though she already knew the truth of who he was, having learned it privately days before, there was something entirely different about hearing it confirmed so publicly, so formally, by a man bowing before him in the middle of her own street. The reality of exactly how far his world truly stood from hers struck her freshly, viscerally, in a way private conversation by firelight had somehow not fully conveyed. "Charles," Alexander said, stepping forward to grip his steward's shoulders warmly, genuine emotion evident in his voice. "Thank God, is Charlotte safe? Is the estate secure?" "Charlotte is safe, Your Grace, and has been searching tirelessly for word of you, Charles confirmed. But we must speak urgently. We've uncovered evidence of who arranged the attack against you, and your grace. I fear we may not have much time before matters grow worse. There have also been whispers, through channels we've been monitoring, that men in Edmund's employ have been actively searching this very quarter of the city for the past several days. The words had barely left Charles's mouth when a commotion erupted from the far end of the street. Harold Gray, the very man Alexander had glimpsed weeks before in the market square, came into view flanked by two rough-looking companions, clearly having followed some trail of inquiry that led them, at the worst possible moment, directly to this exact location. "There he is," Harold shouted, pointing directly at Alexander, any pretense of subtlety abandoned now that discovery had already occurred. "Grab him quickly before he runs again." Chaos erupted along the quiet street. Charles's two guards immediately stepped forward, placing themselves protectively between Alexander and the approaching threat, while neighbors scattered in alarm at the sudden violence threatening their peaceful morning. Alexander, without a moment's hesitation, pushed Alina firmly back into the cottage and behind him, positioning his own body between her and the danger closing in. "Stay back," he told her urgently, his voice hard with an authority she had never heard from him before, the voice, she realized in that instant, of a man accustomed to commanding respect and obedience in moments of crisis. "Please, Alina, stay inside." The confrontation that followed was brief, but fierce, Charles's guards proving more than capable against Harold's men, years of proper training evident in every controlled, effective movement compared to the crude, brutal tactics of their opponents. One of Harold's companions went down hard beneath a well-placed blow, while the guard facing Harold himself forced the man backward step by step, disarming him of a hidden blade with practiced efficiency, before pinning him firmly against the cottage wall. Alexander, unwilling to remain merely a spectator to a fight fought on his behalf, moved to assist, years of forgotten training from childhood lessons in self-defense, insisted upon by his father alongside more scholarly education, resurfacing with surprising ease. Between Alexander, Charles's guards, and the sheer chaos of the unexpected resistance, the confrontation ended within minutes, Harold and his two companions restrained and thoroughly subdued, their planned ambush having failed entirely against defenders they had clearly underestimated. Alina watched the entire scene unfold from her doorway, having disobeyed Alexander's instruction to remain fully inside, unable to simply hide while danger threatened someone she cared for so deeply. When the fighting finally stopped, and Harold and his men lay restrained upon the cobblestones, she found herself staring at Alexander with an expression that mixed fear, relief, and a dawning, overwhelming understanding of exactly how dangerous the world he came from truly was. "Are you hurt?" she asked, rushing to his side despite everything, checking him over with careful, urgent hands. "I'm fine," he assured her, though a small cut above his eyebrow suggested the fight had been closer than he wished to admit. "Alina, I'm so sorry you had to see this, had to be part of this danger at all." "Don't apologize," she said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly with residual adrenaline. "Just tell me it's over now. Tell me this is finished." Charles stepped forward then, his expression grave despite the successful resolution of the immediate confrontation. "This particular threat is contained, miss," he said gently, "but I'm afraid the larger matter is far from finished. We have Harold Gray and his men now, and with proper questioning, they may provide testimony that helps confirm what we already suspect about who ordered this attack. But the man ultimately responsible, your Grace's own cousin, remains at Ravensmore Hall, likely unaware yet that his plan has failed so completely. We must return immediately, before word reaches him and he has opportunity to flee, or worse, to attempt some further desperate action." Alexander nodded grimly, understanding fully what needed to happen next, even as every instinct in him rebelled against the idea of leaving Alina now, in this moment of fresh danger and uncertainty. He turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "I have to go," he said quietly. "I have to face Edmund, ensure Charlotte and the household are properly protected, and see justice done for what was attempted against me. But Alina, I don't want this to be goodbye. I want you to come with me if you're willing. I know it's an enormous thing to ask, leaving everything familiar behind for a world you've had no reason to trust until now. Alina looked past him, at the restrained men on the cobblestones, at Charles and his guards standing watchful and ready. At the fine carriage she now noticed waiting further down the street, clearly the transportation that had brought Alexander's steward into her humble neighborhood. The full weight of what he was asking settled over her slowly, the recognition that saying yes meant stepping fully into a world of dukes and estates and dangerous political rivals, a world entirely unlike the quiet, simple life she had always known. But she thought too of the man who stood before her now, the same gentle soul who had helped mend her curtains and learned to knead bread dough despite clearly having never done manual labor before in his life. The man who had shared his loneliness and his hopes with her by firelight, who had just placed himself physically between her and danger without a moment's hesitation. Whatever world he came from, whatever title he carried, the person underneath remained the same man she had come to care for so deeply these past weeks. "I'm willing," she said finally, her voice steady despite the enormity of the decision. "Let's go face this together, Alexander." It was the first time she had used his full name, and something in his expression shifted at hearing it. Warmth and gratitude, and something that looked remarkably like hope all blending together as he pulled her gently into an embrace, careful of her modest sensibilities even in this moment of relief, right there on the street in full view of curious neighbors and Charles's approving, misty-eyed gaze. Within the hour, arrangements were made. The restrained men were secured for transport back to the estate for proper questioning by local authorities, and Alina gathered what few precious belongings she owned into a single worn traveling bag, taking one last look around the small cottage that had been her entire world for so long before locking the door behind her for what she suspected, with a mixture of sadness and anticipation, might be the very last time. As their carriage pulled away from the quiet street, heading toward Ravensmore Hall and whatever confrontation awaited them there, Alina reached for Alexander's hand, finding it already reaching for hers. "Whatever happens next," she said quietly, watching the familiar streets of her old life recede behind them, "I'm glad I stopped in that alley that night." "So am I," Alexander said, bringing her hand to his lips in a gesture so natural it surprised them both. "More glad than I could ever properly express." The carriage rolled onward, carrying them both toward Ravensmore Hall, toward Edmund and the reckoning that awaited him, toward a future neither of them could fully predict, but that both had decided, in that quiet moment of chaos and resolution, they wanted to face together. The journey to Ravensmore Hall took the better part of 2 days, and with each passing mile, Alina watched the countryside grow grander, the modest cottages of her own neighborhood giving way to sprawling farmland, and eventually to the kind of manicured estates she had only ever imagined from stories. When the carriage finally turned onto the long, tree-lined drive leading to Ravensmore Hall itself, she found herself gripping Alexander's hand tightly, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the house rising before them, its stone walls and countless windows reflecting the afternoon light like something out of a dream she had never dared to have. "It's a lot to take in, I know," Alexander said gently, noticing her wide-eyed silence. "It was simply home to me growing up, but I remember visitors often reacting much the same way you're reacting now." "It's beautiful," Alina managed, though beneath the awe, a thread of anxiety pulled tight in her chest at the thought of walking into this grand world as anything other than a servant, which was the only role she could imagine someone like her filling within such surroundings. Alexander seemed to sense her worry and squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You belong here, Alina, exactly as you are," he said firmly. "Never doubt that, whatever anyone in this house might say or think." The carriage rolled to a stop, and before Alexander could even properly disembark, the great front doors of the hall burst open, and Charlotte Ashford came rushing down the stone steps with none of the composed dignity expected of a lady of her station. tears streaming freely down her face, as she threw herself into her brother's arms the moment his feet touched the ground. "You're alive," she sobbed into his shoulder. "I told them you were alive, I told everyone, but as the weeks passed I began to fear." She could not finish the thought, simply holding on to him tightly as though afraid he might vanish again if she released her grip. "I'm here, Charlotte," Alexander murmured, holding his sister close. "I'm sorry for the fear I caused you. It's over now, or nearly so." When Charlotte finally composed herself enough to notice Alina standing quietly nearby, she wiped her eyes and offered a warm, curious smile. "And who is this?" she asked, glancing between Alina and her brother with dawning understanding. "This is Alina Whitfield," Alexander said, pride evident in his voice as he made the introduction. "The woman who saved my life. Without her I would not be standing here today." Charlotte's eyes widened with fresh emotion, and before Alina could offer any formal greeting, Charlotte had pulled her into a warm embrace as well. "Then I owe you a debt I could never possibly repay," Charlotte said sincerely. "Thank you, Alina. Thank you for saving my brother's life." The warmth of Charlotte's welcome eased some of Alina's anxiety, though the larger challenge of the day still loomed ahead of them. Word of Alexander's return would spread through the household within minutes, and with it, word would inevitably reach Edmund, wherever within the vast estate he currently occupied himself. They did not have to wait long. Edmund appeared in the entrance hall within a quarter hour, his expression carefully arranged into one of relieved astonishment, though Alexander, watching closely now with full knowledge of his cousin's likely betrayal, thought he detected something colder flickering briefly beneath that polished surface, something that looked remarkably like calculation rather than genuine joy. "Alexander," Edmund said, approaching with arms spread as though to embrace him. "Thank heaven we feared the absolute worst. Where have you been all this time? What happened to you?" Alexander did not step forward to accept the embrace, instead holding his ground and watching his cousin's face carefully. "I was poisoned in my own study, Edmund," he said flatly, "and dragged from this house by men who intended to leave me to die of exposure somewhere the truth would never be discovered." Edmund's arms slowly lowered, his expression shifting through several rapid stages: surprise, concern, and finally something that looked almost like nervous confusion, though Alexander no longer trusted a single flicker of emotion crossing that familiar face. "That's monstrous," Edmund said, his voice carefully controlled. "Do you have any idea who was responsible? I'll see them punished severely, I promise you that." "I believe I do have a very good idea," Alexander said, his voice growing colder with each word. "Charles has spent the past weeks gathering evidence, Edmund. A servant hired recently and now conveniently vanished. A late evening drink requested through unusual channels rather than my own valet. Men connected to a fellow named Harold Gray, who I understand has long been in your personal employ, and who we captured just yesterday attempting to finish what was started against me weeks ago." The color drained visibly from Edmund's face as the full weight of Alexander's knowledge became clear, the careful mask of concerned relief crumbling rapidly into something far more desperate. "Alexander, I don't know what you've been told, but I assure you, whatever suspicions you've formed are mistaken. I would never." "Don't," Alexander cut him off sharply, years of restrained patience finally giving way to open anger. "Don't insult me further with denials, Edmund. We grew up together. I trusted you completely, gave you authority over this estate the moment I vanished, believed in your loyalty even when others quietly questioned it. And you repaid that trust by trying to have me killed for an inheritance that was never rightfully yours to claim." Edmund's composure shattered entirely then, years of carefully suppressed resentment spilling out in a bitter rush of words. "It was never fair," he said, his voice rising with genuine, long-buried anger. "You inherited everything simply by being born 3 years before me, while I inherited scraps and expectations to be grateful for whatever charity you decided to extend. I worked just as hard, studied just as diligently, yet none of it mattered because the accident of birth order decided everything before either of us ever had a chance to prove ourselves. "So your solution was murder," Alexander said quietly, the coldness in his voice more devastating than any shout could have been. Edmund had no answer for that, his anger deflating suddenly into something that looked closer to despair, as he realized fully the consequences now closing in around him. Charles, who had been standing quietly nearby throughout the confrontation, stepped forward at that moment, along with two estate guards who had clearly been positioned nearby in anticipation of exactly this outcome. "Edmund Ashford," Charles said formally, "you are to be held pending formal investigation by the proper authorities into the attempted murder of the Duke of Ravensmore. I would advise you not to resist." Edmund looked around the entrance hall, at Alexander's unwavering expression, at Charlotte's tearful, furious glare, at the guards awaiting his cooperation, and seemed finally to understand that any further denial or resistance would accomplish nothing. He allowed himself to be led away quietly, his ambitions and his freedom both ending in that single, devastating moment within the grand hall he had so nearly claimed as his own. Elinor watched the entire exchange from a respectful distance, her heart aching for the genuine pain evident beneath Edmund's terrible actions, even as she understood completely why justice needed to be served for what he had attempted. She moved to Alexander's side once Edmund had been led from the hall, sensing the heavy weight of emotion he was clearly working to process. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, echoing the question he had asked her so many times over the past weeks. Alexander let out a long breath, some of the tension finally leaving his shoulders. "I will be," he said. "It's a strange thing, grieving someone who's still alive, mourning the relationship I thought we had while facing the reality of what he actually did. But it's over now, truly over. Thanks to you, Elinor, and to Charles, and to Charlotte's stubborn faith that I was still alive somewhere out there." Charlotte joined them then, wrapping an arm around her brother's shoulders. "Come," she said gently. "You've both had an exhausting journey, and there's a great deal still to sort out, but it can wait until you've properly rested. Elinor, I'll have a room prepared for you immediately, and anything else you might need." That evening, as the household slowly began settling from the day's dramatic events, Alexander found Elinor standing quietly on a stone balcony overlooking the estate's vast gardens, watching the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and gold across the manicured grounds. "It's beautiful here," she said softly as he approached, "but it feels like a different world entirely from everything I've ever known." "It is a different world," Alexander agreed, coming to stand beside her. "But Elinor, I don't want you to feel like a stranger within it. This can be your home too if you're willing, not as a servant or a guest, but as someone who belongs here in her own right beside me." Elinor turned to look at him, searching his face in the fading light. "Alexander," she said carefully, "I saved a dying stranger in an alley because it was the right thing to do, not because I ever imagined it might lead somewhere like this. I don't know the first thing about being a duchess, about managing an estate this size, about navigating whatever society expects from someone in your position." "Neither did I once," Alexander said with a small, warm smile. "Everyone learns these things eventually, Elinor. What matters isn't whether you already know how to navigate this world, but whether you're willing to learn it alongside someone who cares for you more deeply than he's ever cared for anyone else in his entire life." Elinor felt her heart swell with an emotion too large for simple words to properly capture, standing there in the golden evening light beside a man who, weeks before, she had known only as a dying stranger in need of rescue, and who had since become something far more precious than she could have ever anticipated. "Then I'm willing to learn," she said softly, "as long as you're patient with all the mistakes I'm certain to make along the way." "I can promise you infinite patience," Alexander said, drawing her gently into his arms as the last light of the sunset painted the sky above Ravensmore Hall in brilliant, hopeful color. "For the rest of our lives together, if you'll have me." The weeks that followed brought a formal investigation into Edmund's actions, led by county magistrates who took careful testimony from Harold Gray and his captured companions, from the servants who had noticed unusual behavior in the days before Alexander's disappearance, and from Charles Bennet's meticulously gathered evidence. Edmund, faced with overwhelming proof of his guilt, eventually confessed fully to the plot, sparing the household further public scandal through a lengthy trial, though the consequences of his confession ensured he would spend many years removed from society, his ambitions and his freedom both permanently forfeited by his own desperate choices. Charlotte, though heartbroken by her cousin's betrayal, found comfort in the fact that justice had been properly served, and in the return of her brother to full health and safety. She threw herself into welcoming Elinor warmly into the family, spending long afternoons teaching her the customs and expectations of noble society, though always with patience and genuine affection rather than the cold formality Elinor had feared might accompany such lessons. Elinor found the adjustment challenging at times, learning to navigate formal dinners and social calls, learning which fork belonged with which course, and how to address visiting nobility with proper deference. But she never lost the genuine warmth and straightforward honesty that had first drawn Alexander to her in that humble cottage weeks before. Rather than trying to erase who she truly was to fit some rigid mold of aristocratic perfection, she brought her own authentic self into this new world, and found, to her quiet surprise, that many within the household and the wider community came to respect and even admire her precisely because of that genuine, unpretentious nature. Alexander, for his part, found himself a changed man in the months following his ordeal. The experience of nearly dying, of being saved by someone with absolutely nothing to gain from the kindness she offered, had shifted something fundamental within him. He grew more attentive to the well-being of those who served his household, more willing to listen to concerns from tenants and workers across his estate, rather than simply issuing directives from a comfortable distance. He established, with Elinor's enthusiastic support, a program providing proper support and shelter for those in the county who found themselves without homes or resources during harsh winter months, remembering vividly his own desperate, freezing night in that alley, and determined that no one else in his lands should face such peril without someone willing to help. Word of the Duke of Ravensmoor's dramatic survival, and of the humble baker's assistant who had saved his life before eventually becoming his intended bride, spread quickly through society circles, generating no small amount of gossip and speculation among those who found the entire story almost too remarkable to believe. Some among the aristocracy sniffed disapprovingly at the notion of a duke marrying so far beneath his station, murmuring about how such matches undermined proper social order. But far more people, upon hearing the full story of Elinor's selfless courage that freezing night, and of the genuine devotion that had grown between the couple in the weeks that followed, found themselves charmed rather than scandalized, viewing the match as proof that true character mattered more than birth or title. Alexander proposed to Elinor on a bright morning several months after their arrival at Ravensmoor Hall, choosing, quite deliberately, not the grand ballroom or elaborate gardens where such proposals typically occurred among the nobility, but the humble kitchen garden where Elinor had taken to spending many contented hours, teaching the estate's cooks new bread recipes she remembered from her own mother. Finding in that small patch of earth and growing things a comforting echo of the simpler life she had left behind. "I know this isn't the grand gesture society might expect," Alexander said, kneeling among the herb rows with a ring that had belonged to his own mother clasped carefully in his hand. "But I wanted to ask you here, in the place that feels most like you, rather than in some grand hall that feels most like the world I was born into." Elinor, kneeling among her herbs with dirt still under her fingernails, laughed through happy tears as she said yes, understanding completely and cherishing entirely the thoughtfulness behind his choice. Their wedding, when it finally occurred that autumn, blended both worlds beautifully. It was held in the grand chapel at Ravensmoor Hall, attended by nobility from across the county, yet Elinor insisted on baking the wedding bread herself, a small but meaningful tradition from her old life that she refused to abandon entirely. And the guests, noble and common alike, remarked afterward that they had never tasted bread so wonderful at any society wedding before. Charles Bennet, standing proudly near the front of the chapel throughout the ceremony, found himself unable to hold back tears of genuine joy, having served this family faithfully through its darkest hour, and now witnessing its brightest, most hopeful chapter unfold before him. Charlotte served as Aliner's attendant, having grown to love her brother's chosen wife as dearly as any sister could, grateful beyond words for the courage and kindness that had brought Alexander safely home to her. In the years that followed, Aliner Ashford, Duchess of Ravensmore, became known throughout the county not merely as a woman who had married well, but as someone who used her new position to genuinely improve the lives of those around her. She expanded the winter shelter program she and Alexander had established together, ensured proper wages and treatment for all household staff, and remained, despite her elevated station, someone who would still personally deliver fresh bread to families struggling through difficult times, refusing to let her new title distance her from the compassion that had defined her long before any duke had ever entered her life. Alexander governed his estate and eventually took his place within Parliament with a wisdom and empathy that surprised many who remembered the colder, more guarded man he had once been, before a desperate night in a frozen alley had taught him, in the most painful way possible, exactly how much genuine kindness truly mattered in a world too often ruled by calculation and ambition. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first met, Aliner would tell the story simply, without embellishment, exactly as it had happened. A cold winter night, a stranger dying in an alley, a choice to help rather than walk past. And from that single act of compassion, an entire life had blossomed, proving, as she always concluded the telling, that the smallest acts of kindness could carry consequences far larger and far more beautiful than anyone could ever possibly predict. Alexander, listening to her tell the story yet again, would simply reach for her hand across whatever room they happened to be sitting in, grateful beyond measure that on that particular freezing night, of all the people who might have passed that alley without a second glance, it had been Aliner Whitfield who stopped, who knelt beside a dying stranger, and who decided without hesitation that his life was worth saving. It remained, throughout their long and genuinely happy life together, the truest thing either of them ever knew, that love, real love, rarely announces itself with grand gestures or careful planning. Sometimes it simply begins with someone brave enough to stop, to kneel in the cold beside a stranger, and to offer help freely, expecting absolutely nothing in return. 5 years into their marriage, an unexpected letter arrived at Ravensmore Hall that would test the family once more, though in a far different way than the danger they had faced before. The letter came from a small parish far to the north, from a modest clergyman writing on behalf of a woman who had recently passed away in his care, a woman who, in her final days, had confessed to once working as a maid within a wealthy household many years earlier, and who had asked, with her dying breath, that a letter be sent to the Duke of Ravensmore concerning matters she had kept silent about for far too long out of fear. Alexander read the letter with growing confusion, uncertain what connection this stranger might have to his own life, until he reached the final paragraph, where the clergyman explained that the woman, named Agnes Coleridge, had once served in Edmund's own household years before the attack, and had witnessed something during that time she had never dared report, fearing retribution from a man whose temper and ambition even then had unsettled the staff around him. She had apparently overheard, quite by accident, an earlier conversation between Edmund and a hired associate discussing methods of removing obstacles from one's path without leaving traces of foul play, a conversation that predated the actual attack on Alexander by nearly 2 years. This revelation meant that Edmund's plot had not been a single, desperate decision made in a moment of resentment, but rather something calculated and planned over a considerable length of time, evidence that, had it come to light during the original investigation, would have resulted in an even harsher judgment against him. Alexander brought the letter to Aliner that evening, his expression troubled as he explained its contents. "Part of me wants to pursue this further," he admitted, "to ensure the full truth is finally documented properly, but another part of me wonders whether reopening old wounds serves any real purpose now, years after everything was already settled." Aliner considered this carefully, understanding the weight of the decision before her husband. "What would pursuing it accomplish?" she asked gently. "Edmund is already facing the consequences of what he did. Would additional evidence change his circumstances further, or would it simply cause pain to Charlotte and to you, reliving something you've both worked so hard to move past?" "I don't know," Alexander admitted honestly. "I suppose I feel I owe it to the truth itself, to ensure nothing about what happened remains hidden or uncertain." "Then perhaps," Alina suggested thoughtfully, "you write back to this clergyman, thank him for passing along Agnes Coleridge's final wishes, and have the information properly recorded with the magistrates for the sake of completeness, without necessarily reopening any public proceedings. The truth can be honored and preserved, without needing to become another painful spectacle for the family to endure again." Alexander considered her suggestion and found real wisdom within it, a reminder of exactly why he valued her counsel so deeply: her ability to find balanced, compassionate solutions to problems that others might have approached with far less nuance. He followed her advice precisely, ensuring the additional testimony was properly documented and preserved within official records, providing complete historical accuracy without subjecting his family to another round of public scrutiny and painful memory. Charlotte, when eventually told of the letter's contents, expressed quiet gratitude that the matter had been handled with such careful discretion. "I've made my peace with what Edmund did," she said softly, sitting with Alina and Alexander in the same garden where Alexander had once proposed. "Learning it was planned even longer than we knew doesn't really change anything for me now, except perhaps confirming that the man I thought I knew as a child had already begun down that dark path far earlier than any of us realized. I'm grateful you handled it quietly, for my sake as much as anyone's." That autumn brought happier news to balance the difficult letter from the north. Alina, several months into her second pregnancy, gave birth to a healthy daughter, whom they named Margaret, after Alina's dear friend from her bakery days who had remained a close and treasured companion even after Alina's elevation to Duchess. A friendship Alina had steadfastly refused to let fade despite the vast differences now separating their daily circumstances. Their first child, a son named William, doted immediately on his new sister, and the halls of Ravensmoor that had once felt cold and formal during Alexander's own childhood now rang regularly with genuine laughter, and the comfortable chaos of a family built on warmth rather than mere obligation. Charles Bennet, well into his later years by this point, took particular joy in watching the children grow, often telling them stories, with Alexander and Alina's amused permission, about the dramatic events that had first brought their parents together, embellishing certain details with each retelling, until young William was convinced his father had single-handedly defeated an entire army of villains to rescue his mother, rather than the more modest, though still remarkable, truth of the matter. Alina continued her charitable work throughout these years, expanding the winter shelter program into a network of support that reached far beyond the immediate estate, providing not just temporary shelter, but genuine pathways towards stable, dignified futures for those who had fallen on hard times. She often visited these shelters personally, refusing suggestions from certain more traditional members of society that such direct involvement was beneath her station, insisting instead that understanding the real struggles of those she aimed to help required more than distant charity offered from a comfortable remove. It was during one such visit, several years after her marriage, that Alina encountered a young woman in circumstances remarkably similar to her own past, working long hours in a struggling bakery to support herself after losing her family, dreaming of one day owning a shop of her own, but lacking the resources to ever make that dream a reality. Alina recognized something of her younger self in this woman's quiet determination, and quietly arranged, without any public announcement or expectation of gratitude, for the funding and support necessary to help the young woman eventually establish her own small bakery within the county, ensuring that the kindness once shown to her by circumstance and fate could ripple outward to touch other lives in turn. Alexander, watching his wife's continued dedication to helping others without any thought of personal recognition or reward. Often reflected on how completely his life had transformed since that desperate, freezing night when he had collapsed in a stranger's alley, certain his life was ending. He had gained not merely survival, but a partner whose fundamental goodness continually inspired him to become a better version of himself. A family filled with genuine warmth rather than cold obligation, and a renewed sense of purpose in using his considerable resources and influence to genuinely improve the lives of those around him, rather than simply maintaining his own comfort and status. On the anniversary of the night Alina had found him, they made it a quiet family tradition each year to prepare a simple meal together, bread and broth, the very same modest fare Alina had fed him during those first desperate days of his recovery. A humble reminder amid their considerable wealth and privilege of exactly where their story had truly begun, and of the values they wished to carry forward into whatever years still lay ahead of them. "Do you ever wonder," Alina asked him one evening, years into their marriage, as they sat together watching their children play in the same garden where he had once proposed, "what might have happened if I had simply walked past that alley that night, told myself it wasn't safe to stop, that someone else would surely come along to help?" Alexander considered the question seriously, watching his children's laughter fill the golden evening air. "I try not to dwell on it too often," he admitted, "because the answer is too painful to properly consider. But I think about it enough to remain endlessly grateful that you were exactly the kind of person who couldn't simply walk past someone in need, regardless of the risk or inconvenience involved. That single choice, made in a moment of freezing darkness, changed absolutely everything that followed, for both of us, and for everyone whose lives we've since had the privilege of touching." Alina smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as the sun set gently over Ravensmoor Hall, painting the sky in familiar, beautiful colors that had witnessed so much of their shared story unfold beneath them. "I suppose we were both rather fortunate then," she said softly. "That kindness turned out to matter so very much more than either of us could have possibly imagined that night." And in the years that followed, through every challenge and every joy their long life together would eventually bring, that simple truth remained the steady foundation beneath everything else, that a single act of compassion, offered freely to a dying stranger on a bitterly cold night, had proven powerful enough to reshape not just two individual lives, but the lives of an entire household, an entire county, and generations still to come.